Welcome to the One Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. Mosiah chapters 13 and 14. Chapter 13 overview. After what Abinadi said in the last chapter, the king responds by saying he's mad and telling his priests to kill him. But when they try, he says that God will smite them if they touch him, because he hasn't delivered the message that God has given him. He then gives that message, which is primarily quoting the Ten Commandments, and also says that the prophets of the past have all prophesied of the Messiah and the redemption of the people, and that they said that God himself will come down in the form of a man. Despite its length, there really isn't too much to talk about this chapter when it comes to individual verses. So in this post, I will be combining chapters 13 and 14, because chapter 14 is basically a verbatim quote of Isaiah 53. If you're not familiar with that, it's one of the more famous chapters in the Old Testament, speaking clearly of the crucifixion of Jesus. But in chapter 13, verse 5, when Abinadi threatened them if they touched him, quote, his face shone with exceeding luster, even as Moses' did while in the Mount of Sinai, while speaking with the Lord. Of course, when we think about that originally happening in the Old Testament, plus what 2 Corinthians 3 says about it in the New Testament, that it was because of Moses' being with God and receiving the law from him, we see the incongruity of Abinadi's face shining here, out of the blue in the midst of the city and surrounded by wicked men. And it cheapens what happened with Moses to see if it's spoken of in this way. The bulk of the chapter, verses 11 through 24, are Abinadi reading the Ten Commandments. I didn't check them just to make sure that it was exactly verbatim with the King James Version, but it looks close enough to me. Then at the end, he asks them if they've done this, that is, done the Ten Commandments, and taught the people to do this. He then answers the question himself in the negative, saying that if they had done these and taught these things, God would not have sent him. And then he continues by saying that it is currently expedient for them to keep the law of Moses, but a time is coming when that won't be the case. Obviously, this couldn't have been written actually in Old Testament times. It could only be written in the light of the New Testament. In verse 29 it says, and now I say unto you that it was expedient that there should be a law given to the children of Israel, yea, even a very strict law, for they were a stiff-necked people, quick to do iniquity, and slow to remember the Lord their God. Is it just me, or does this sound like the worse a people is, the more stubborn and stiff-necked they are, the more laws they are given? Which is funny, considering the many and strict and heavy laws placed on the Mormons, and how they view biblical Christianity as cheap grace because of the lack of laws. In speaking of the law, verse 31 says in part, all these things were types of things to come. However, since they were supposedly still living in Old Testament times and still subject to the law, it should say, all these things are types of things to come, being yet future, not already in the past. Which, of course, makes it look like the Book of Mormon was first written in English in the 1800s, so that it was actually speaking of the past as the past, just pretending to be the future. Finally, the chapter ends in more modalism, with verses 34 through 35 saying in part that God himself would come down and that he himself should be oppressed and afflicted. While Mormons differentiate quite strongly between Jesus and Heavenly Father to the point of saying that they are not two persons in the triune being of God along with the Holy Spirit, but that they are separate beings and separate gods. The Book of Mormon, however, does not so distinguish them. Instead, we see it repeatedly said that there is only one God and that Jesus is that God, and even that Jesus is the Father. Moving into Mosiah 14, it is almost a word-for-word copy of Isaiah 53, with the only changes being not really worth noting. However, they're so short, I will note them anyway. In verse 8 in the King James Version, it says transgression, singular, but the Book of Mormon says transgressions, plural. Verse 9 in the King James reads, and he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. But the Book of Mormon changes violence to evil. Verse 11 in the King James Version and the 1830 Book of Mormon are identical. He shall see of the travail of his soul, but the modern Book of Mormon removes the word of. And finally, verse 12 in the King James and the 1830 are identical again, But the modern version changes he bare the sins of many to he bore the sins of many. Again, it's not really a change, just modernizing the language. But why would they modernize this word and leave all the other antiquated words alone? So all in all, no real changes in this chapter. Even changing violence to evil isn't that big of a change, because typically one would assume that the sort of violence under consideration wouldn't be just any violence at all, but the sort of violence that would come from a wicked or an evil heart. Perhaps Joseph Smith changed violence to evil because he might have thought that Jesus' cleansing the temple would be a form of violence, so saying Jesus did no violence and then having Jesus do violence would be a contradiction. But violence is retained in the Joseph Smith translation of Isaiah 53, so it doesn't really work that well. He could have just been being inconsistent, which would be no great surprise, or maybe this was just one of the many changes he introduced when quoting from the King James, so that it wouldn't be exactly verbatim.